Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our today's ZEF Senior Research Seminar. Today we are very proud and happy to have with us Dr. Richard Byron-Cox, Capacity Building Officer from UNCCD, who will talk about should land degradation neutrality be made a fundamental principle of international law. Before the presentation, let me give a few words about Richard, his background. He has a PhD on international law, and he has been for the last 16 years working for UNCCD, so almost from the beginning. And before becoming Capacity Building Officer, Richard was the Program Officer at the Latin American and Caribbean unit of UNCCD. When we say land degradation neutrality, we don't care, we are neutral. What we mean is we want to achieve no situation when there is no further land degradation. So there is, any land degradation is compensated by improvement. Can we do this? Can we be a part of the legal system? What are the challenges? What are the barriers on this today? We'll hear from Dr. Byron-Cox. Welcome, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Firstly, let me say it's a great honor and a great privilege to be here to address you on this topic. I want to make it very clear that I'm happy that this is a sort of research institution, because I'm not here to say to you that I'm the end-all and the be-all of this subject, or that I can tell you as Socrates would what the answers are. No, actually, we need to find the answers. And my job at the UNCCD involves this. And so it is my intention to share what I think, what I believe as regards this matter, based on the facts as they exist. Again, I want to thank each and every one of you for coming. It's an honor and a privilege. Now, as you see from the team, we want to address the question of land degradation neutrality, but within the context of law, and in particular, international law. Now, if I have a tendency to become a Southern Baptist preacher, you know those Southern Baptist preachers in America? I have a tendency to become that sometimes. So if I'm becoming that, stop me and say, hey, where you going? Slow down, all right? Because I know we have limited time. However, this subject is not as simple as it would seem. And before one decides whether or not land degradation neutrality should become a principle of law, one has to understand what is land degradation neutrality, you know. But even before you understand what is land degradation neutrality, you need to understand what is land degradation in the first place. Now, if you were to look in Google, because everybody uses Google these days, when I was in primary school and secondary school, you had some big dictionaries and encyclopedias. Oh, it's a matter of just typing in a couple of words and you find it, you know. But if you look it up, you would see that there are many different definitions of what is land degradation, many different definitions. And as you would know, in the world of science, generally speaking, definitions have got to be a bit precise. But when you have to deal with the whole world, this is a difficult thing. For example, if you were to use the word, let's say, solution. A solution, generally speaking, in the English language, is to find an answer to a problem. However, solution in chemistry means a solute and a solvent. Okay? So one has got to be very, very careful. One has got to understand what one is talking about. Now, as regards UNCCD, they have a very long definition as to what is land degradation. It's so long that even though I credit myself with an elephant memory, I have to read it for you. This is what they say. Land degradation means reduction or loss in arid, semi-arid, dry subhumid areas of the biological or economic productivity and complexity of rain-fed cropland, irrigated cropland, or range pasture forest and woodland, resulting from land uses from a process of combination or a combination of processes, including process arising from human activity. And it goes on, that's only part. Now these people are crazy, right? I mean, how can you ever work that out? Some other people come up with some simpler definitions. One I just want to read for you. It is a process in which the value of biophysical environment is affected by a combination of human-induced processes acting upon them. Now, that is only 2 lines, but even there again, there's a complication. So that's our first complication. There's no universal agreement as to what this thing is. And secondly, the thing itself is very, very complex. And that is only land degradation. We haven't reached neutrality yet. We haven't gone to neutrality yet. Just land degradation itself. Because this is a question of science. And sometimes we tend to believe that natural science, you know, the laws of natural science are rather simple and easy to understand. +2 plus +2 is +4. And whether here or in China or on the moon, it's the same thing, right? But the issue of land degradation proves to be sort of elusive as regards the definition. Now, outside of that, all of the definitions I've looked at, and I've looked at many of them because I've been in this business before some of you were born, you know, and all of these definitions, I saw one thing in common: human relation, human action, or human behavior. This is the first part of law, which we will come to in a while. Because if you look up a definition of law, you would see that there are millions of definitions as well. But there's one thing which is common. Law is a rule that governs behavior. Law is a rule that governs behavior. So this is where they try coming, but we'll get to that in a short while. Now, as I was saying, the one constant in these definitions is human behavior, you know. But sometimes people would say to you, well, natural forces. So for example, I'm from the Caribbean, and we have hurricanes, we have storms and so on, okay? And this causes degradation. But sometimes people would say, well, that has nothing to do with human beings. Is that really true? I'm not too sure, because I have been on this earth for a long time. And I can tell you in my childhood days, the hurricanes that we have in the Caribbean now were much less and much less intense. They were much less in numbers and less intense. And science seemed to be saying that human behavior as regards climate change is a fundamental reason why this is happening. But I'll give you a simple example. I live on an island called St. Vincent, and that's a very mountainous place, you know. And the farmers there, when they're farming, they use hoes, you know, a metal sort of instrument. And this is a mountainous place, and they keep pulling the soil downwards. So, over a period of time, the top level of the mountain becomes empty. There's no soil. The rain falls, and the whole place is flooded, you know, because there's no soil and no tree to keep the thing down. But I'll go on with another example in a short while. However, the point is this, that human behavior, that's the point I want to drive home, because this is where we now connect the natural science, which is land degradation, to the social science, which is human behavior. Now, as I said before, the question of land degradation is difficult, but then the question of neutrality is even more difficult. But before I go into that, because there's a reason why people come up with this idea about neutrality. One has got to deal with, why is land degradation important? Why is it important that we address this business? Well, this is the frightening part. And this is going to frighten all of you, those of you who don't know it. And those of you who know it, well, you should wake up worried every morning. Because generally speaking, the facts are these, that 24% of all arable lands in the world is degraded. 62% of agricultural land is degraded. Either severely or little, but it's degraded. You have 2 billion people living in these degraded areas, right? And that is just the small part of the picture. I will get to the bigger part in a short while. Why I'm telling you about the small part of the picture? It is because land degradation, as we understood it, and as most people understand it now, we're seeing as a third world problem, a problem for Africa. So you see Africa, sub-Saharan Africa and so on, things are dry and people are starving and they have whatever, right? It was a problem for the third world. It was not anybody else's problem. And so the third world should deal with it. We will try and help them. So if you look, you will see that the agreement that covers land degradation, it specifies in that agreement, especially countries in Africa. That is written on the name of the convention. Therefore, already narrowing the argument to a particular continent and a particular space. That is a mistake, a serious mistake, and I will prove it to you. But however, as I've said before, the question was seen as a third world question. And if you want proof of that, let me tell you this. There's something called the Global Environmental Facility. The Global Environmental Facility is supposed to finance, basically, the programs to deal with the environment. Climate change, biodiversity, and so on. Listen to this carefully. Climate change was, the GEF was made the financial institution for climate change agreement, even before the agreement was actually enforced. So too for biodiversity. There's something called the PICs and the POPs. Those of you who deal with these things would know what they are. Those are also conventions. Even when they were writing these conventions, they had already agreed that the Global Environmental Facility will be the financial mechanism. In other words, they were securing the monies to ensure the implementation of those conventions. When the Land Degradation Convention came into being, and this incidentally is the only true Rio Convention, because it was in Rio that they agreed to establish this convention. You know what the developer said? Oh, no way. That's Africa's problem. Africa find money to do that. They did not agree that the Global Environmental Facility should finance the UNCCD. They did not agree. It took a battle of 8 years, which I was part of, for them to finally come to some sort of consensus. Now here you see clearly a political difference, right? That political difference is an expression of what I want to get to. People's behavior. The behavior was different. Now, so now that we have established that little thing, let's deal with the land degradation neutrality business. Now what does this mean? We have a problem with land degradation itself. We don't even know what that is. So what is land degradation neutrality? Well, again, there are many, many definitions of this thing, and too many of them to read. But before I get into that, I just want to give you a little short note, which is important to understand. We were concerned only with land degradation originally. Now we are concerned with land degradation neutrality. And we are concerned with it being a global thing. In other words, the argument has now been broadened away from Africa. Why? That's the question. From whence this understanding of land degradation neutrality? Well, firstly, actually, it was UNCCD who did this. And there's a reason why they did this. UNCCD did this because the UNCCD as a convention, if you look at it, you would see it only has blanket norms, general norms. It has no specific targets and no specific time frame or anything of that sort. So they then went on and realized, but how the hell are we going to implement this convention if there's no targets? So they came up with something called a 10-year strategy, which runs from 2008 to 2018. And in there they said we should do this, we should do that. But again, it was only focused on a narrow set of things, or space, geographic space, Africa and the third world. And somebody realized, no, this is not going to work. You need a universal target, right? And so the idea of land degradation neutrality was born. And as you know, there was the Rio Plus 20 conference in 2012, and that was the first time in any international agreement that this was mentioned. Paragraph 206, where the countries of the world agreed in principle, and I use that word in principle in brackets because I'll tell you why. But they agreed in principle that the world, the whole world, needed to deal with this land degradation neutrality. Okay? We need to deal with the question of land. And because they agreed to that, this is why we are here today. This is why the world now has this on its agenda. But the question is, what really is land degradation neutrality? As I said earlier, how do we define this? You're going to aim at something that you don't know. So it's like you saying to me, look, we're going to find the planet, name a planet, planet Nuzumbo. You don't know that there's a planet named so. In the first place, you don't know there's a planet named so. And you tell me go out there and find it. No, you don't give me a map. We don't even know that planet, but I'm supposed to go out there and find that planet. Doesn't make sense, does it? So therefore, we need to know what is land degradation neutrality before we go on. And you have a whole pile again. This is where the confusion begins. A whole pile again of different definitions. Some people say no net loss to land. Some people say it is restoring twice time the amount of land that you degrade. Okay? Some people say, no, that is not the answer. The answer is that all the action that we take should not in any way or the other decrease the productivity of land. And so you have a whole pile of definitions. The question is so difficult that UNCCD at its last conference of the parties, which was held in Namibia, agreed to set up an international intergovernmental working group just to define what this thing is. So you have a whole set of scientists now fighting over as to what this thing should be. You understand what I'm saying? Now, that is a serious question. Because as I say, you can't tell me to go and look for a planet somewhere in space when you don't even know if a planet exists. You don't know how it looks. You have no idea about it. So that is a challenge. And the challenge is still going on. But guess what? The world has already agreed that yes, this whole issue about land degradation neutrality is an important issue. Because in principle, at Rio Plus 20, agreed that that document, some of you here will know it, is called The Future We Want. And Article 206 tells us clearly that, okay, they agree. But imagine that, huh? People agreeing to something that they don't know what it is. That is madness. Doesn't make sense. So, we must understand why people decide that they should agree to this. Well, guess why? Because by 2030, this world would have to produce 30% more food. By 2030, about 47% of the people on this planet would be living in water scarce areas. In other words, they wouldn't be able to have water. By 2030, we would have to increase the production of energy by about 45%. And the figures go on and go on. And that is only 2030, which is 15 years from now. The figures show that by 2050, the population of this planet would be 9 billion. When I was a child, the first time I ever heard about the population of the planet, they said it was 3 billion. That's the first time I heard. As far as I know now, it's close to 7 billion. And by 2050, it's going to be 9 billion. The physical space of this planet remains the same. But all those people need water to drink, food, and so on and so forth. So, what do we do? You know, in the Caribbean, and in the Bible actually, because they took it from the Bible, there's a statement that goes this way: where there is no vision, the people perish. It's an important thing as regards the environment. If you can't see down the road, we in serious trouble. Think about it now. That we have 7 billion and about 3 billion of them in poverty. And then we're going to have 9 billion in 2050. Right? How are we going to handle that? So this is why people in principle agree. Because they realize the danger down the road. This is why. In principle, people agree. Now, I come to the second part of what I want to talk to you about. So we have, because I could talk for the next 3 hours, believe me, but we don't have that. So I give you the basis and then we can discuss whatever you want. Now, So people in principle have agreed. And there are those in this world who say, well, this is a question of environment. This is why I'm talking to you today. And I want to know if you will agree with me or not. I bring myself here so that you can crucify me and say, no, what you're talking is nonsense. But listen to me first. You can't crucify me until you follow my argument. I say that land degradation neutrality, even though we haven't yet defined what it is, must become a principle of public international law. Not just a narrow confine as regards environment, or a narrow confine as regards agriculture. No, I believe land degradation neutrality must become an overall principle of international law. It is based, first and foremost, on some of the things that I've mentioned. The crisis that this planet has found itself in, and the greater crisis that is looming if we don't act. Now, but the main reason is this. I said earlier that for me, the fundamental definition of law is a rule that governs people's behavior. A general rule that governs people's behavior. So for example, you drive in your car and the speed limit says 50 and you go 60, the police catch you, you're in trouble. Right? The general rule is that thou shalt not kill. You kill, you're in trouble. Right? That is what law does. It governs your behavior. You know? And international law is different from what is called municipal or national laws. In that international law governs the behavior of countries. In other words, in Latin it's called jus gentium, right? The law of people, so to speak, or nations. And that is what international law does. It governs the behavior of states, of governments, of countries. But international law has several branches. Those of you who would have studied the science would know that you have the law of treaties, you have international trade law, you have international law of the sea, and so on. And you could go on and go on. I'm here to tell you that all the fundamental branches of international law, this principle of land degradation neutrality must be codified and become part of those, not any narrow area of law. And I prove it. So let us deal with first, as I said, several different branches. You don't mind me sitting down, right? I have this attitude of misbehaving when I'm talking. Now, let us deal with a couple of branches to prove my point. There's something called international atomic law. International atomic law really governs states' behavior as regards atomic energy. It is because of this why Iran is having this big battle with the United States. Okay? Because the United States say, well, international law say you're supposed to do this, this, this. And the United States say, well, yeah, we are conforming. But America doesn't agree. You know that, right? You read about that every day. Or you see it on TV. Now, listen to this. In 1945, 2 bombs were dropped on Japan. The first 2 atomic bombs ever in the history of humankind. To this day, certain areas where those bombs were dropped, the plants grow deformed. To this day, it means that the earth was poisoned. But if that is not enough, the Americans had a war against Vietnam. And Vietnam had very thick jungles. And the Viet Cong was hiding in that jungle. The American government used a spray called Agent Orange to deal with that. I'll cover that in a short moment because that is also under environmental law. But let's continue with atomic law before I go on. I'm sure that all of you here know about Chernobyl. I'm sure. And I'm sure you know that according to some scientists, the soils around that area is poisoned for 500 years. But that is a little story because according to the statistics we have, what happened in Fukushima is even worse. That is what all the stats says. So therefore, my argument is that in terms of international atomic law, it must be fundamental that you don't practice this thing if you can't assure us that land is going to be safe. But alright, you disagree with me on that one. Okay, fine. I ain't have a problem. Let's deal with international trade law. Trade is about exchange of goods and services. In Europe today, and I like it very much, people don't buy certain shirts and shoes and so on because they're made in Bangladesh, where people are extremely exploited. And that is true. There's also something called fair trade, right? Where, you know, you buy products at a more reasonable price from the third world and so on and so forth. Listen to this. Oil is one of the biggest things that we trade today in this world. Okay? Go down to Nigeria and see what I wouldn't call the oil company name has done down there that they haven't cleaned up. No, go and check it out. You don't have to believe me. It is just a fact. It's a reality. You understand? Look what happened, for example, in the Gulf of Mexico, of America, when this whole thing turned up. American government made it clean up the whole thing, pay people a whole pile of money. But the Gulf in Nigeria is a different story. Would you refuse to buy oil from that company? Well, okay, fine. The oil argument, you might say, is an easy one to make good. Then let's deal with trade as regards sugar, bananas, and things like that. The Caribbean used to have a preferential agreement with the European Union. Then come the Americans and so on and say, no, we have to have free trade. You understand? Now, they can produce bananas and sugars, you know, vastly cheaper than the Caribbean. So guess what happened? The whole Caribbean, banana and sugar and rice industry collapsed. All that land. Now, we don't know what to do with it. And so it's just there, degrading when the rain pours. That is as far as trade law goes. Let us deal with another thing. Let us deal with fighting international drug trade. As you know, the Americans and so on have a big battle going on. Places like Colombia, Bolivia, but in the Caribbean as well. I live in St. Vincent. Now, St. Vincent is a very mountainous place, and we have a lot of marijuana. You know what is marijuana, right? We have a lot of marijuana down there. Listen to this. We signed an agreement with the Americans to deal with the marijuana, because America has this big fight against marijuana. Good. The marijuana ripens or matures just before the rainy season. Now, this marijuana business is illegal in my country. So all the people who plant it way up in the mountains, you know? Yeah, because it's illegal. Right? As a matter of fact, one of my brother-in-law is a minister of government. And one day, he took me down the road, part of his constituency. He said, "Would you look over there? What do you see over there?" I said, "That's forest." He said, "Forest? That's marijuana. Whole place full of marijuana." You understand? But just before the rain come, the Americans come with their helicopters and they spray the entire marijuana crop. So the marijuana crop dies and then the rain pours down. This is a mountainous place. So guess what happened? Tons and tons of soil is washed into the sea every year. And when you look out from my window, you can see up to 3-4 miles the seawater ground. That means all the soil is down there. I could go on if you want me to go on as regards that fight, but I wouldn't, because I want to leave some time for you to ask me what you want to ask me. See, and I was talking about sea. Let's talk about love for sea. I think you know very well, I don't have to tell you, that the sea is not just about water, it's about resources, and it's about trade. Now, the same Caribbean I just told you about, when that land degradation that I just told you about with the Americans happens, all that mud drowned the corals there. You know, the coral reefs, where all the fish and conch, etc. live. All of that is drowned by this mud. So the whole sea environment, that the law of the sea agreement of 1982, which incidentally was signed in the Caribbean, Montego Bay in Jamaica, that whole sea environment is damaged. And that's just the fact. there is an interrelation between the land and the sea that cannot be disputed. So there you go, even off the sea, but that probably doesn't bother you. Okay, so let's deal with the question that we are in Europe, we're in Germany. I like Germany. That has nothing to do with it, actually. I'm just telling you how I feel. But the fact of the matter is this. Listen to this carefully. There's something called refugee law. Refugee law is governed by a treaty of 1938 or 33. And people are given refugee status because of certain things. Your political belief, they're chasing you out of your country because you don't agree with the government or something like that. So every day practically, you have thousands of people from Africa coming across the Mediterranean, knocking the doors of Europe. You know why? Because there's no opportunity at home. A lot of people believe, that people just migrate because they love to travel. Nonsense. The majority of people you see doing that is because opportunity is not at home. And they have to find it somewhere else. And in Africa, there's nothing that denies people opportunity the way non-productive lands. Non-productive lands deny people more opportunity than any other thing in Africa. You better believe that. It is a fact. Check it out, you don't have to believe. All right, but then you don't agree with me on that. Good. Well then let us talk about international peace and security. Let us discuss that. Because I am telling you that the body I work for now, and what is the most prestigious international organization on the planet and in the history of humankind, is the United Nations. You look at the United Nations, and you would see that its first objective is the maintenance of peace. There's nothing that threatens national peace in some countries of this world, sub-regional peace and regional peace, like degraded land. Nothing. Please believe that. I can use the Horn of Africa if you so wish, but I can also use my own Caribbean. Let me tell you something. In the Caribbean, we have an island named Hispaniola, where it's Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And we wanted the Bahamas to ratify the convention. And we tried and they refused. When I joined, the convention was just born, so to speak. And then all of a sudden, the boss decided, you from the Caribbean, you go down and talk to them. So I went down there to speak to them. But I did some research before I went. And I realized that in 5 years, the Bahamas repatriation budget had moved from $25,000 a year to $7 million a year. $7 million. And that kind of figure bothered me. And when I checked it, guess what? All of these people were coming basically from one place, Haiti. All of these people were coming from Haiti. And I just said to the minister, I said, look, this is your budget. Imagine what it's going to be down the road if you don't try and help this situation. He said, we will have to have a war with them because we're going to keep them out. And these are all Caribbean people like himself here. Nothing threatens international peace and security like this. Finally, I'll just go to one little branch of international law, and then we could talk a little bit more. There's something called international economic law. It deals basically with the overall economic development of the world. And that law is one that ranges from things like mining, production of gold and so on, to price of goods and commodities and so on. I can tell you that whether you believe this or not, a lot of the mining practices that take place in the third world by the same companies who does it somewhere else. They don't live up to the standards. And that leads to serious land degradation. But if you don't believe me, think about this. Trade in lumber is a big part of international economics. Do you want to know how much forest is destroyed in Brazil alone every year to feed this business? And we are not talking yet about Indonesia, you understand, and other places. Do you want to know? This is serious business. This is serious business. There are other areas of international law that I can discuss, but I have to leave some room for you to tell me you disagree, and I talk a whole pile of nonsense. Okay, we can have an argument over that. But I'll close by saying these things. I believe that law is supposed to govern people's behavior. And I believe that unless we change our behavior to land, this world, this planet, will ultimately tip over. You know, the problem we have is that our economic behavior, our environmental behavior, and so on, is not governed by law of integrity. It is governed by greed. It is governed by greed. Whether you like this or not, this is a fact. And this is the great challenge we face today. How does science convince greed that this is not the way? This is going to destroy us all. You know, I sort of believe that behavioral pattern is something that has got to be forced upon us for our own good sometimes. For our own good sometimes. And behavioral patterns, as regards the environment, cannot be governed by greed. I want to challenge you to do a little bit of thinking with me before I finish. Just a little bit of thinking. As I said, I can talk for 4 hours. I just want to do a little bit of thinking. Listen to this. If you look at all the environment treaties and so on, and everything we say about the environment, it will cover climate change, and it will tell you about carbon stocks and how much money the carbon market is worth. It will cover water, you know, and how much wars we're going to fight about water. It will cover land. In international economics, there's even something now called land grabbing, which we could discuss, but we don't have to discuss that. But guess what? Land does not only produce water. Land does not only produce food. Land is not only a habitat. Land produces the most fundamental thing, which, according to some information I got, you can't live beyond 6 minutes if you don't have it. Air. I was told, since I was a small boy, that we give off carbon dioxide and the plants give off oxygen. That's what I was told. And I was told that the Amazon in Brazil, in the Americas, is the lungs of this planet. And if you chop it down, we would all die. But you notice they never had any international agreement as regards this. You know why? Because you can't bag air and sell it. You could bottle water, you could sell land, you know, you can sell carbon stocks. But nobody has found a way yet to bag air and sell it. And that is why you see there's no agreement in relation to that. So ladies and gentlemen, the question is this. Knowing the facts that we know, and understanding that the nexus of everything is land. Everything. You know, I hear people talk, I always say this when I have a lecture. I hear people talk about, oh, climate change, and we need to sequester carbon, and blah, blah, blah. I look at these people, I really laugh. Because the first fact is this, that land is probably the best, good land is probably the best sequester of carbon there is in the world. But secondly, even if you dispute that, we come to trees, right? Because trees are what's supposed to sequester carbon. Where the hell are you going to plant the trees? In the sky? In the sea? Where? On land. And the better the land, the better the trees will grow. So again, my argument is this. The disease is our behavior to land. We have to change that behavior. And land must become a principle of international law so that every country in its actions, its behavior, make sure that whatever action we do or don't do doesn't make our land any worse. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Richard, for this passionate lecture. And the floor is open for questions. We can take maybe a batch of 2-3 questions at a time, and then you answer them. Please, Jan.
I'm sorry if I don't disagree with you. We wanted a bit more disagreement, but I think it's a good thing to have as a fundamental principle in international law. What I'm not so convinced of is how much it will actually change the problem for the good. We have a big discussion now in these international conventions debates on whether rules should be legally binding or not. And so what my sense of what I get from those negotiations is that it's always more difficult to reach a consensus when the rules are legally binding, and it's kind of easier to at least achieve a vision if it's not legally binding. But even if it is legally binding, it's not necessarily changing anything. So you gave the example of Brazil. Brazil, all the chopping down of the Amazon forest has been illegal for 40 years. At the point where the government changed its mind on doing something about that, they started to implement that law. And in response, the law was reformed and basically watered down to what we have now as a new law. So law itself is definitely not enough. I would like to hear your views on sort of how much more potential for success we might get if we write it down into a law as opposed to any other way of finding a consensus at the national level or finding a vision.
Second question? No. Okay.
My question is also related to that, and can it be that the reason why land is also not at this time out of the international agreement, because land also represents many things like you mentioned?
Okay, let's take these.
Okay, thank you very much, and I couldn't agree with you more. The issue of international law has always been, well, when I studied at university, they always call it soft law, because there was no mechanism to back it up. So for example, in Germany, there's a law that says you shouldn't steal or kill, and if you do so, then there's a whole system that comes into place. Police arrest you, you're taken to court, and you will be sentenced. There's a price to pay if you break the law. Now, the fact of the matter though is this, that in international agreements, people can agree to certain things and don't do anything. But when it's a principle, which is a different thing, when it is fundamental, when it's constitutional, when it becomes the backbone of the system. So for example, let's take a look at the sea. In of the sea, regardless of what you say or don't say as a country, you have territorial sea, okay? And every country has a right to pass through that territorial sea. Every country, right? They have a right to pass through to get to the other side. And if you break that law, the whole world will condemn. Or let us take diplomatic law. As you know, there's the Edward Snowden business going on in England, right? And he ran into the Ecuadorian embassy, is it? Yes, the Ecuadorian embassy. He's still there. Is it Ecuador? Oh yes. Assange. Sorry, Edward Snowden is the one in Russia. Yes. Thank you very much. Confused it. But he ran into this embassy, This is a small country that doesn't have the might or power of England, but that's a principle of international law. You cannot enter somebody's embassy without their permission. I'll go further to show you something. You might recall this, that somebody from the Libyan embassy once shot a policewoman from within the embassy in England. This happened about 5-6 years ago, okay? And he broke the law. He killed the policewoman. But still, the British government could not go in that embassy because it is a principle of international law. So my argument is not just making it a norm of international law, but a principle, a fundamental core issue. Now, if we can agree to that, then I don't think there would be a problem of people sort of accepting it. Rather, we would still have the problem of how you enforce it. Now, this could only be done when you have a way of measuring it, okay? Then it can be done. So this is why I argue for a principle, and not just a norm, but a principle. Because a principle is something you don't break, you know, and you don't apply willy-nilly. But your argument as to the difficulties of this is solidly taken. But I always say this, that sometimes it takes man a long time to understand certain things. But he comes around to it sooner or later. I believe the best example of that is Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So people armed themselves for 50, 60 years, but nobody ever used it again. Because they learned a lesson. Nobody ever used it again. You know? And I think if we come to understand how fundamental this is, then yes, it is possible. But I do agree with you. If we look, I'll finish by saying this. If we look at the climate change treaty, when it started, it was just a political basa here and there. But then with the coming of the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and overwhelming evidence, and the possibility of mixing money into the whole thing, in other words, having a carbon market that is worth billions of dollars, okay? The situation's changed a bit, and it continues to change. But, again, I would say that what you've asked, and I agree with you totally, it's not a simple thing. But then, this is why I'm here, right? If this was a simple subject, anybody could come here and talk about it, right? This is what we are made for as human beings, to challenge ourselves, to do what is better, you know? So this is my understanding of where we are, where we need to go, and the challenges that are there. But I do believe that the challenges can be overcome. Now, as regards the whole issue of land and so on, I believe that until now in international law, the bioproductive value of land was never totally understood, or people never really paid attention to the question. Land was always about territory, space, and geopolitical relations, first and foremost. Outside of that, it was about resources in the land. In other words, gold and silver, etc., etc. And that was it. But now, we have come to understand, as I've said before, by 2030, 15 years from now, we have so many challenges that we have no choice now but to change our relation. But let me give you something to think a little bit about. When we talk of sustainable development, there must always be the possibility of renewing, of reproducing. Okay? Once we talk about sustainable development, there must be the possibility of renewing, of reproducing, or otherwise it's not sustainable. So for example, if you have this glass full of gold, and you take out some all the time, that's it, because the gold doesn't renew itself. Now, in terms of biodiversity, we need this renewal and this reproduction, otherwise it will disappear. Okay? In terms of food, same thing. In terms of renewable energy outside of the sun, okay, and to an extent the wind, all of the renewable energy depends on land. So what I'm saying is this, that land is the fundamental key for reproduction and renewing. If you want to talk about hydroelectricity, for example, without proper land and proper watersheds and so on, it will not work. It cannot work. Simple. If you talk about renewable energy in terms of these fuels that you use from cane and so on, again, it's land. If you talk about the biodiversity, birds or whatever, and their reproduction, they need a habitat. The habitat is what? Land. So I think that one of the problems was that we never truly put in context the real value of the reproductive nature of land itself, and land being the source of this reproduction. But I think now that we're getting there, we're coming to understand that this is essential. So I do agree with you that, you see, land was always a political subject first and foremost. It was always a geopolitical subject. So countries went to war over the boundary here, over the boundary there. Now it has become a bioproductive subject, which is essential to our sustainable development.
Okay, 3 more questions with the lady, second and the third question.
Yeah, thank you very much for the talk. Okay, so you take the position that principles of international law, once they come into being, they cannot really be, nothing can be done about them. But my question is that once this principle does come to take into place, what are you proposing for the countries to ratify it? And guess who never ratifies anything? And once it is ratified, how are we going to plan it if it can't be enforced really, because that is in the nature of international law that it can't be enforced. So you can make a convention against torture being a non-derogable right, somebody doesn't ratify it, and then interprets a case with the ICH wrong, and then does whatever they want to. So how are you planning on getting around that?
Thank you very much for a very interesting and thought-provoking lecture. I do completely agree with you that you said land is at the nexus of the major development challenges that we are facing today. My question would be, to what extent is UNCCD pushing forward with the issue of food security related to land degradation? Because I see there is a close relationship between land degradation and food security, and based on your argument, I do think that it would also complement it if you reflect on the international law of food in relation to what you've been talking about. So how do you see? My first question is, what is the position of the UNCCD related to food, in relation to food security? And the second would be, have you ever thought about linking your argument with the law of food or international law on food? That would, I think, would complement what you've been talking about.
Okay. Yes, thank you. First of all, an excellent lecture, and I agree with you 1,000% that land degradation is probably one of the most serious problems on this planet. Where I tend to disagree, and I think it picks up on the point this gentleman made on this issue of accountability. Why is the focus on international law? If we look at plant breeding, it's never worked when you try to breed one variety for a whole country. Things tend to work better at the local level, and I think that maybe the fact that UNCCD is focusing on international law may be a stumbling block, because you've already admitted that the accountability of international law, and all the laws you mentioned, it's because countries don't agree. Things work at the local level, and therefore it should be a fundamental principle of local law. I mean, if you take an island which is losing its land because people are using sand to build buildings and the land is sinking, it's that island that can bring in laws to ensure that things change. And you can take Bavaria. you know, it might be better to have a principle to focus more at the local level rather than at the international level.
Okay. Thank you very much. Very, very interesting questions, and more up the road I was looking for actually. Let's do with number one. The thing about, well, firstly, I do not necessarily, well, I did not say that once it becomes a principle of international law, it cannot be changed. The world is dynamic and dialectic in its very essence, so things can change. But a principle of law only changes when the objective reality which demanded that principle change. If the objective reality changes, then the principle itself has got to change. Okay? But to come directly to the question of implementation and a mechanism, right? In international law, it is not true to say that there is no mechanism to enforce certain things. But this first and foremost deals with international peace and security. There is a Security Council that will punish you, depending on who you are, if you break international law as regards peace and security. So the point is that there is a precedent in international law where mechanisms exist and where they can be used. For example, we know the International Criminal Code of the International Criminal Code, right, in The Hague. And of course, I agree, it has only been African presidents who have been arrested, but they have been arrested. Well, you had the people from Serbia and so on. They have been charged and they have been put in prison. So the point is, it is not that international law does not know precedents as regards that. No, it does. There is evidence of that. But, however, in a situation like this, where the issue is not necessarily a threat to international peace, the answer to that, I believe, is incentives. More than punishment, rather incentive. So, for example, in other third world countries, I can tell you, and I have colleagues here who will tell you, well, no, I don't see anybody here who can tell you this, who can certify this on my behalf. But what I can tell you, for example, is that if you look at UNCCD, right, we have a big problem in getting in the national reports. Why? Because we don't give them much money. They don't get much money for doing it. But all the countries do their climate change reports, because climate change gives you $500,000, you understand, $500,000, to a small country like Barbados, where I was born. That's a lot of money. And they make sure they get the report done. Okay? That's the first thing. So I think it is the approach that we need to use here. I think the way the international system is right now, I agree with you that a punishment mechanism in that sense cannot and will not work. But an incentive mechanism, this is why, for example, in climate change you have this big global carbon market now. And everybody is trying to get into it. As I said, I'm from the Caribbean. And there's a country in South America, but belongs to us in the Caribbean, called Guyana, right? And some of you would know that Guyana has signed an agreement with Norway, where Norway provides, I think, over a period of 10 years, $200 million. And Guyana does not chop down the forest, but rather use this money to find alternative means to employ people, you know, educate them and so on. And the agreement is working. Okay? So it is an incentive sort of approach. But I do not believe it is that our minds as human beings are limited only to seeing things in one way only, right? I don't think so. I think our practice has shown that man is creative enough, you understand, to find certain answers to certain questions. Now, in a concrete sense, it could be possible to set up a protocol. Once you understand what is land degradation neutrality, once you agree as to some sort of system and measuring it, which is not simple, I agree. Because if you, for example, just to give you an example, if you were to use land cover, right? If you were using land cover, you could end up with what is called green deserts, where you had a forest, which had animals, which had a particular ecosystem and so on and so on. You chop it down, and then you plant, let's say, soil. And you have to put, you know, whatever into the soil. The whole ecology changes. The biodiversity that lived in that forest disappears, and so on and so forth. Now, can you say that no land degradation took place simply because you have equal amount of land cover? my argument would be no. Okay? So it's not that simple. But as I say, the challenge is for us to be creative. I believe that in every challenge there is an opportunity. No challenge can exist if intrinsically it does not include an opportunity. And this is an opportunity for us. Now, as regards food security, yes, I think that is probably the most fundamental question that needs, at the international level, that needs to be tackled. For many reasons, but first and foremost because basically people are hungry. But secondly, because it's a threat to international peace and security. Okay? So at the international level, the whole question of how you make this food business related to the whole question of the environment is fundamental. But there are other problems as well here, you know. For example, the problem of overproduction and wastage. The facts prove that we produce enough food to feed everybody right now. The facts are there to prove this. It is just how we dispose of this and how we use this. So, but as regards to UNCCD, the UNCCD is built on Agenda 21. It is built on Agenda 21. It says so in its opening article. And as you know, fighting poverty is an essential element of Agenda 21. So the UNCCD has done a lot of work on this, but of course, it's a small organization, limited resources, and there's not a commitment at the international level. Finally, this question, a very good question, as regards how you deal with this business about focusing at the national level rather than at the international level. You see, a classic understanding of a principle of international law is a principle of law which is shared by all nations nationally. That's a classic understanding of a principle of international law. In other words, the principle of international law only becomes a true principle when everybody in this world, or the majority of people, say, no, this is really so. So for example, if you look at all the constitutions, modern constitutions, whether they are from continental law or they have a reception of British law, common law, you will find a chapter that governs human rights. All constitution, right? You will find a chapter that governs electoral laws. You will find that, right? Because that is a principle. It is written in each and every contemporary democratic constitution. So when we argue a principle of international law, the understanding, at least from my standpoint, and the arguments of, for example, Hans Kelsen, who you know was a German international lawyer, right? If you look at the arguments produced by these people, you would see that that is their argument. That's the first thing about that we need to say. So I do not see an international law principle as something which is imposed from above that has nothing to do with the national laws of a country. So for example, as you know, UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, was signed in 1982. And within that, it has a maximum of 12 nautical miles territorial sea. Now, what you have seen is that this principle has found reception in almost every country's law as regards the sea. So that's the first part. The second part is this, which is even more important in this sense, is that today in international law, as was in the past, the agenda is driven a lot by either punishment or incentive. And I believe that if we have this as a principle at the international law level, then it will create the opportunity for incentive. In other words, for others to come on board. That's the first part of it. The second part of it is this, and this is what really bothers me. As you know, based on the Washington Consensus, every country is supposed to open their economy and private sector is supposed to come in and do whatever they want to do and help your economy and so on. The private sector is supposed to push the process of development, right? But as I have said earlier, what we have seen is that within this private sector process, certain standards are maintained, for example, in Germany or in America, but other standards for other places, Nigeria or wherever, right? And that in itself tells me that people are susceptible to the money and not to the principle, if you understand my point. So, yes, the long and short of the answer is yes, it has to be at the national level. But my understanding of the principle is exactly that. In other words, it is a principle which finds its reception at the national level. Okay?
Thank you very much for the lecture and for your questions and answers. I hope you have now gained a lot of new ideas about this land degradation neutrality, and will also join forces with UNCCD and other partners to work for a world where there is land degradation becomes less and less. Thank you.